Villains, we hate them, but at the same time we love and need them. Without a powerful villain, the show just feels flat. Oh look, the protagonist beat down the incredibly weak villain once again. There's no sense of stake or urgency, and therefore it feels like the best shows are usually built by the best villains. Madara, Aizen, All for One. See, I feel as though that shows that have one overall arching villain that pulls the strings from the shadows are truly the best kinds of shows. This is why people were so upset with things like the ending of Naruto. The entire show built up to Madara and then poof, there goes Madara. But I believe this is why villains like All for One are so loved by the fandom. A dark, mysterious, brooding, and incredibly powerful villain pulling all of the strings of the dastardly deeds of MHA from the shadows. But who is All for One? What are his abilities? What quirks has he stolen? And what is his grand master plan? Well, we're gonna answer all that and more in a second, but before we get into that, guys, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. So All for One, arguably the strongest quirk user on Earth. A man who has been hunting down One for All and users of it for generations. A man who's stolen as many quirks as he has lives. The true symbol of evil and the unabashed symbol of trying to make those with quirks rise above everybody else. A man dedicating his life to the propagation of the strong and the subjugation of the weak. He is both the founder and the leader of the League of Villains. And yet MHA has done an incredible job of making us know next to nothing about this man, but we do know a little bit, and that's what I'm going to tell you about today. But before we get into that, we're going to start these videos in the way that we tend to start these videos, at the beginning. You see, we don't know a huge amount about All for One's childhood. In fact, we know nothing about it whatsoever. See, we know that All for One was born with his quirk, All for One, an ability to steal quirks from others and either give them to himself or give them to somebody else, essentially giving him full control over anybody with quirks. He has a hole in one hand that allows him to suck out quirks and a hole in the other that allows him to expunge quirks. He is essentially a quirk vending machine, but he wasn't born evil. We learned from Yoshi when they came to Deku in a dream a little bit about All for One's, well, not childhood, but like first days, and how All for One wasn't always a super evil person. See, in the beginning of All for One's, I guess, career, he did use his abilities to help people. However, he would only help people, like giving them quirks or just helping them out of bad situations, if they agreed to enter into his servitude. A bit like Marcus Crassus, who was the richest man in the history of Rome. So rich that he created his own fire brigade. And this fire brigade would go around putting out fires around Rome. Only problem is they wouldn't put the fire out until the people who lived in the building agreed to sell the building to Marcus Crassus. And since this was ancient Rome and there wasn't just a fire force, they had to agree. This is basically what All for One did, saving people from dire situations, but at the same time gaining a follower. But if you agreed to enter his servitude and ever defied him, he would abandon you or have his followers kill you. So it wasn't the world's greatest sports team to be a part of. But how did All for One get like this? Well, besides being born with a quirk that gave him a pseudo-god complex, because he was able to take control over even the strongest of other quirk users, because he could simply take their quirk and use it against them. All for One also read a fictional story when he was a child about a demon lord who was the strongest person in the land and used their powers to control Japan. Ironically, this whole demon lord story is actually most likely a reference to Sukuna, who was a real historical figure in Japanese lore. And as All for One grew his following, his god complex got stronger and stronger. But that wasn't the only thing getting stronger and stronger. He himself was also getting stronger and stronger. Because here's the thing, even if you were faithful to him, that would not stop All for One from just stealing your quirk one day because he wants it. And therefore, All for One looked at his following as an endless pool of quirks that one day he could steal and give to himself or somebody else, giving him complete and total control over everyone's actual power. Kind of like a god. All for One even used to love his younger brother Yoichi. However, as his god complex got worse, he became more and more condescending to Yoichi, who was supposedly born without a quirk. He wanted Yoichi to be able to assert his ideals onto the world, much like how All for One was. But here's the thing, this loving side of All for One didn't last for long. You see, because as a child, All for One read these comic books about a demon lord who used his power to basically destroy all of a civilization. And instead of looking up to the heroes, All for One looked up to the demon. And as he read about this demon, he idolized it, claiming that his powers of All for One were meant to thwart the future of humanity. That is to say that All for One's entire goal is simply to end humanity. He wants to be the symbol of evil. There is no greater good. He is not a broken hero. He is the manifestation of evil in a quirk-driven world. And his greater goal is simply the destruction of civilization as we know it. His only other goal outside of the destruction of civilization is to steal One for All. But here's the thing, All for One can't steal One for All. He's tried twice. All for One tried to steal One for All from both Daijiro Banjo and N, but both times he was unable to steal the quirk, which means that he needs somebody who can steal the quirk, which is where Shigaraki, aka Tomura Shigaraki, comes in. See, All for One is a manipulative megalomaniac, but he's quite good at it. So much so that he can feign fatherly feelings to make Tomura feel as though he actually cares about him when he's actually just trying to use him as a vessel. In fact, All for One has actually told this to Tomura. He's told Shigaraki that he's more of a vessel than a protege. But since he's been manipulating and gaslighting Shigaraki his entire life, Shigaraki is attached to All for One kind of at the hip. But All for One wants this at the hip connection to go a bit further, because All for One wants to use Shigaraki as a vessel, because All for One believes that after merging with All for One, he will finally be able to steal One for All. But here's the thing, All for One, evil to the core. He doesn't care whether or not this merge changes him and or kills him, as long as Shigaraki continues his vision of being the symbol of evil. That is to say that as long as human civilization is spiraling towards a fiery demise, he's happy, alive or dead. But the prospect of killing off All for One is a daunting one. I mean, after all, this is the man who's killed almost every single user of One for All. He killed his own brother Yuichi, the second wielder of One for All, the third wielder of One for All, the fourth wielder of One for All, lived in the mountains his entire life to make sure to not fight All for One, so he actually didn't kill the fourth wielder, but he killed the fifth wielder and the sixth wielder and the seventh wielder. It wasn't until One for All had finally got past to somebody without a quirk, aka All Might, that All for One finally met his match. You see, since One for All is a stockpiling quirk and truly is at its strongest in a quirkless person, All Might was able to stand up to All for One. And when they battled the first time, it was a pseudo draw. That is to say that All for One was permanently disfigured and All Might was also permanently crippled. All Might was the one who was left standing though, and All for One was brought to prison. But All Might almost killed All for One. This fight left All for One senseless. Now, what do I mean by senseless? Essentially, All Might crushed his skull. The reason All for One's entire head is scar tissue is because of All Might. All Might basically smashed his skull in, depriving him of taste, scent, sound, smell, anything. His skull is just skin and brain. And after this moment, All for One was required to use a life support system. All the stuff he wears with all like the wires and things, that keeps him alive, like Darth Vader or Bane. Well, Bane in the Christopher Nolan movies. In the comics, it's just what pumps his venom into him. But just because All for One was now technically on life support and had none of his senses did not mean he was weak. This is the form he was in his second fight against All Might. You know, that battle where before fighting All Might, he defeated Endeavor, Edgeshot, Mount Lady, Gran Torino, and Best Genist, like 5 of the 10 strongest heroes of the time.
But Nick, if he can't see, smell, taste, hear anything, how is he fighting?
Fortunately for him, he has quirks, and a lot of them, like infrared. See, infrared allows All for One to sense his surrounding using infrared light. Think of how the Predator sees the world. Essentially, to compensate for his blindness, All for One can sense how the Predator would see the world. However, it doesn't operate exactly like sight. He can only really sense things in his immediate vicinity. So I guess if anything, it's closer to echolocation. But here's the thing, All for One needed a nerf. In his prime, he was as physically strong as All Might, regarded as the most physically strong man to ever live. He was fast enough to dodge attacks from Edgeshot, whose attacks go at the speed of sound, which is fast in the My Hero Academia universe. And I lied earlier when I said he lost all of his senses. He can still hear, and he uses the hearing, which was boosted by the fact that he lost all of his other senses in combination with his infrared sense to feel the earth around him. So much so that he can feel the vibrations in the air to understand exactly what's going on around him. But like, what quirks does he have? Let me tell you, you are not prepared for how long this list is. He has the quirk Search. With this quirk, he can observe and monitor up to 100 people at once. But also by monitoring them, that also means being keyed into their weaknesses. So not only is he able to watch you no matter where you are, he's also able to deduce what your weaknesses are. He has the quirk Warping, which works like Warp Gate but with more rules. See, essentially All for One can make a bunch of black liquid that works as a warp gate, but he can only warp things to or from his location. That is to say, he can't use this quirk to warp himself wherever he wants, but he can use his quirk to warp things to him, like Nomu. He also has Air Cannon, which allows him to shoot air cannons with his arms. Essentially, it allows him to make massive tunnels of wind that he can use as long-range attacks. And these air cannons are so strong that it stopped All Might in his tracks. Speaking of air cannons, we should talk about a quirk that he uses in conjunction with air cannons, spring-like limbs, where essentially he coils his muscles into, well, a coil. And by coiling his muscles into a spring-like formation, it increases the elasticity and the strength of said muscles. Imagine you had a spring right here and you're pushing it down with the entirety of the strength of your arm, and then you release your arm. The power of the spring would shoot your arm out that way, and your physical muscles would do the job as well, thus increasing the strength of this movement. He has the quirk Rivet Stab, which is a bit like Kimimaru Shikatsumiyaku, in that essentially he can just grow tendrils out of his body that he can control and use to stab people. He also has Forced Quirk Activation, which he can use to make somebody activate their quirk whether or not they want to or not. So essentially he could grab Naval Laser by the arm and just make him shoot naval lasers until he gets a tummy ache. Like, he could just use that little French bastard as a turret. He has Impact Recoil, which essentially makes him a Gum Gum Man, meaning that he can take the force of any incoming attack and reflect it upon his attacker, essentially canceling out Isaac Newton's third law, that all actions have an equal and opposite reaction. He has Multiplier, which gives him more arms, Hypertrophy, which allows him to grow the size of said arms, Spear-like Bones, which is even more like Shinkatsu than the previous thing, because it literally just grows spear-like bones coming out of his forearms. He's got a quirk that increases how much kinetic energy he generates, a quirk that increases his strength, a quirk called Life Force that was given to him by Dr. Garaki, which just allows him to live for an inhumanly long time. He can control and manipulate radio waves for some reason, meaning that if you're trying to call for backup, he can kind of just snag your radio wave and make sure that message never gets home. He has Hard Flame Fan, which allows him to make a wall of flames to act as a defensive countermeasure. He has Telekinesis. He can levitate. He can detect lies, so he can find traitors before they get the chance to betray is the word I was looking for. He also has a quirk that allows him to make his skin razor blades. He has a quirk that allows himself to ooze out acid that can dissolve his surroundings. He has Datara's Kinjutsu that allows him to put a mouth on his hand, except instead of eating clay and putting his chakra into said clay, it shoots out an air burst. He has a glue quirk that allows him to make glue, and he has a hardening quirk that allows him to harden his body for incoming attacks, if he even needed to use that, considering he has recoil impact. He's also had a lot of other quirks that he's either passed on or he can't hold, because here's the thing about All For One, he can't stockpile new generation quirks. Now, he can take new generation quirks and pass them off to somebody else, but something about his physiology doesn't allow him to hold on to new generation quirks. So like Uraka's gravity quirk, he couldn't take that and keep it for himself. He would have to pass it to somebody else. Also, because of him being pseudo crippled in his fight against All Might, he can't hold as many quirks as he used to be able to, making him weaker than he used to be, but weaker than he used to be is not really a huge step down. But this is another reason that he's trying to make Shigaraki his vessel, because he believes after making Shigaraki his vessel, not only will he be able to take one for all, but he'll also be able to take new generation quirks. And just like how Deku can combine his meta abilities to make one for all stronger for him, All For One can combine every single quirk he has into a massive ultimate attack. However, just like with how he's been limited to how many quirks he can hold, he's also been limited to how often he can use certain quirks, and how many quirks he can use simultaneously because of his fight against All Might. Oh, and with the addition of Dr. Garaki, it's a high possibility that every single quirk we've ever seen in a Nomu, All For One still has, because Dr. Garaki can duplicate quirks. So it's a solid possibility that the Nomus either have a duplicate of his quirks or he has a duplicate of their quirks. In fact, at the current moment, All For One has a duplicated version of All For One, with the original being in Tomura. Really, the only downside to All For One is that everybody you've ever stolen a quirk from haunts you in your dreams. Which, I mean, like, if you have absolutely no sense of morals, like All For One, isn't the worst thing. And that's sort of it. I mean, I could go significantly deeper into spoiler territory, but I'm not gonna do that. But with the return of MHA Season 6, that's basically everything you need to know about All For One. And if you liked this deep dive on the symbol of evil, guys, tell me in the comments below. And while you're down there, please, for me, like this video, subscribe to the page, and hit that noti bell. Listen, I'm not saying that I need all villains to just be unabashedly evil, but like, the broken hero trope is just so old.